This episode is brought to you by the Educator Hub at the Neurodiversity University. It's a place for teachers, administrators, parents, and more to gather and learn how to better support neurodivergent students and all students so that everyone has an equal chance at a fulfilling education. Look for a link in the show notes.
When people say like, oh, is there a healthy version? I'm like, okay, yes, technically there is, but I'm not so kind of set on it. But okay.
Perfectionism isn't just about neat handwriting or getting straight A's. For many people, it's a way of coping, a drive to control, to avoid rejection, or to measure worth through achievement. But how do we separate healthy striving from the kind of perfectionism that fuels anxiety, burnout, and self-criticism? And what happens when perfectionism overlaps with masking, especially in neurodivergent lives? Licensed mental health counselor Leon Garber joins us to explore the deeper roots of perfectionism, its connection to identity, and how we can begin moving toward more sustainable ways of living and working. That's straight ahead on episode 286. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
You know that feeling when you're the only one in the room saying, hey, this kid isn't broken. The system just isn't built for them. It can feel pretty lonely. That's exactly why we, Amanda Morin and I, created the Educator Hub. It's a place to connect with people who get it. Other teachers, other professionals who are tired of outdated approaches and who want to build classrooms where neurodivergent students actually thrive. Inside the Hub, you'll find things like live expert Q&As, quick 5-minute PD videos, and even roundtable chats where you can swap ideas and stories. It's less about perfection and more about having a community that understands the ups and downs of this work. So if you've been looking for your people, the doors are open now, but only for a short time. Just head on over to neurodiversity.university and click on the Educator Hub tab, or you can click the link in the show notes. We would love to have you join us in the Educator Hub. Okay, my conversation with Leon Garber is here in a minute.
On a recent episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast,
you know, the historical approach, particularly with neurodivergence, has been the overarching goal is how do we make you stop being neurodivergent? How do we make you, it's a meaningless term, but how do we make you act normal? How do we make you stop inconveniencing the people around you instead of how can we support you? What are your goals and values? And understanding that internal experience of living as a neurodivergent person in a world that's not designed for your brain. So there's been a lot more vocalization from neurodivergent communities of why would you do this work without centering the people that you're supposedly here to help, basically.
That's episode 251, Moving from Traditional to Neurodiversity Affirming Therapy. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm speaking with Leon Garber. Leon is a licensed mental health counselor based in Brooklyn, New York. He brings a really rare blend of existential curiosity and clinical know-how to his work and specializes in OCD, perfectionism, and some of those deeper philosophical anxieties about meaning and purpose. On his blog, Leon's Existential Cafe, he writes about everything from self-esteem and freedom to love, death, and what it means to live a meaningful life. He also writes frequently for Psychology Today. Leon also co-hosts the podcast Seize the Moment along with Alan Ullman, where they tap into psychology, philosophy, and personal development. Leon, I am so glad to have you back on the podcast.
I'm very happy to be back. First of all, as I'm sure you know, I love this podcast, and it's so wild that I have like random people coming up to me and telling me about it. And I'm like, oh, if you guys didn't know, I was actually on Emily's podcast before.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So when we talk about perfectionism, I think a lot of people immediately picture someone who's just a high achiever or who likes things to be neat and orderly if they just don't really know a lot about perfectionism. But in reality, it's just a lot more complicated than that. So just to start us off, can you talk about how you define perfectionism? And beyond just that psychological definition, I'm also curious about the bigger picture, like how ideas of perfectionism have been shaped over time and how it influences us today.
Okay, great question. Okay, so I'm going to try so hard not to throw so much at you because perfectionism is an incredibly complicated topic. So when people think of perfectionism, they often think, let's say, so somebody who just kind of wants to be, more or less perfect, right? But it's pretty complicated, right? So the first thing I'll say about perfectionism is it's sort of infused in many diagnoses. So you find perfectionism in autism, you find perfectionism in narcissistic personality disorder, you find it in borderline personality disorder, you find it with social anxiety disorder, right? And not to say that it's prevalent every single time, but the point is to say it comes up probably more often than not. So I'll just kind of use that as a foundation. Okay, so there are several forms of perfectionism. I'm going to try my best to go through all of them. Again, pretty complicated. So, maybe for some of the audience, they might want to rewind some of this because there's going to be a lot of information to take in. Okay, so perfectionism is divided in several ways. So I'm going to go through first I'm going to go through the tripod system of perfectionism, and then I'm going to go through healthy and unhealthy perfectionism. Okay, so the tripod system of perfectionism is essentially there's something called self-imposed perfectionism, which is the standards that you have for yourself. They tend to be extremely high, and they don't take into account one's, let's say, limitations. They don't take into account, the different factors in their lives. The idea is pretty much I have to be perfect no matter what. Then there's something called other-oriented perfectionism, where you essentially impose those standards on other people. So you see this with harsh parents, harsh teachers. The idea is I don't want any excuses. Who are you to tell me this, right? I'm telling you what the standards are. And then you also have what's called socially prescribed perfectionism. This is when it feels like it's internalized, where the idea is it's not so much just me who has these standards for myself, it's other people who expect this of me. So self-imposed perfectionism is more like these are kind of my own internalized standards. Socially prescribed perfectionism is more along the lines of these are my expectations because other people have these expectations of me, or at least I believe. So that's one system of perfectionism. Then let's get into healthy and unhealthy perfectionism. I'll have more to say about this later, but I'm actually kind of pretty skeptical of perfectionism in general. So like when people say like, oh, is there a healthy version? I'm like, okay, yes, technically there is, but I'm not so kind of set on it. But okay. So the unhealthy of perfectionism is pretty simple. It's I have to be perfect all the time, everywhere, and to everyone. So this is what's called absolute perfectionism. So this version of perfectionism doesn't take into account one's environment. So the understanding is it's like, it's not so much about adaptation. It's more along the lines of, in this sort of mythical or mystical way, I have to somehow automatically fit wherever I'm in. So if, let's say, I'm amongst a bunch of beautiful people, I have to be beautiful. If I'm amongst a bunch of math whizzes, I have to be a math whiz too. So the idea is a sort of growth is not really something that's seriously taken into consideration, because the idea is if I'm not perfect, I feel like a terrible person. I feel like I don't matter, I feel worthless, etc., because I have to be perfect in all of these things, or in all of these different ways. Okay, and then so the other version of this is what's called relative perfectionism. So this version takes into account one's environment. So just as a species adapts, as we know, let's say some species would, let's say, who are a little bit more furry and who have coats are not necessarily great in hotter climates, right? Whereas opposed to, let's say, in colder climates, they're a better fit. The idea here is it's one of, one could say, kind of evolution. The idea is that sort of we evolve and we adapt to fit a particular environment. So this version of perfectionism is healthier because this version of perfectionism takes several things into consideration. Number one, adaptation. It takes into consideration the fact that adaptation takes a pretty decent amount of time because, when species evolve, they evolve over millennia. And so the idea here is that one doesn't have to be perfect all the time, but one essentially tries to evolve toward perfection. So why I still kind of have a problem with this is because perfection is still sort of this mystical and mythical idea, is that, like, I mean, look, you can say to yourself, I want to kind of get there, which I completely understand, but you have to also have a dual mind about it. You have to also know in the back of your mind, you'll never get there, right? No species is perfectly adapted to its environment. So the problem is, unfortunately, where this sometimes falters, relative perfectionism, is sometimes people tell themselves, so they use it as an escape. So what happens is they tell themselves, oh, okay, I'll only take risks once I become perfect, once I adapt to my environment. So unfortunately, I mean, that's why I kind of hate the duality of it, of like healthy and unhealthy, because technically speaking, it's like even things that are healthy can sort of be misused. So I like the sort of more tamed version of, or like it enough. I like the sort of more tamed version of perfectionism where, again, you are adapting, you're allowing yourself time, you're not using it as an excuse just to sort of to avoid people, to avoid responsibilities. And you're saying to yourself, as they say, progress without perfection, in the sense of like, hey, I'll get there maybe someday, but right now I understand I'm in this phase of development, which is why I appreciate it. But the point is to say that, like, when it comes to if you do have to choose between the two of them. And so the point is, when it comes to absolute perfectionism, I think it's starkly unhealthy because, you're never going to be able to adapt to every environment at once. And then when it comes to relative perfectionism, it's definitely the more healthier version. Again, I'm also just skeptical of the term healthy here. There are instances where even though some people, they say to themselves, like, I do want to be perfect all the time, there are definitely people still who veer toward the more absolute end of perfectionism, who say something like, well, I don't need to be perfect in everything, but I still need to be perfect in these particular areas. So why that would still be considered absolute perfectionism is essentially because, again, I need to be perfect all the time everywhere, however, but just in these specific areas. So like anything else, I mean, it's a spectrum where there's, let's say, no perfectionism on one end, and there's this ability to sort of adapt and kind of find meaning in whatever your circumstances are. Then there's obviously, let's say, to the other end, there's absolute perfectionism. Closer to the middle is probably relative perfectionism. And all of us in some ways find ourselves in whatever part of the spectrum. But again, if you have to choose, I mean, yes, I would say the relative version is the healthier one. I would stay away from the absolute one no matter what, even if it is a few things that you find that you want to be a perfectionist about, just because, again, you're going to find that in some ways you're going to really disappoint yourself. Perfectionism is significantly associated with obsessive compulsive disorder. So for a lot of our patients with OCD, even if they do focus on a few topics and they're like, well, I just want to be a perfectionist here, the problem is it still takes up an inordinate amount of their time, and it also causes a lot of distress when they fail.
Yeah. I think that's really relevant. And I can think of clients who I've worked with and conversations I've had with a lot of different people, parents, educators, but also just adults talking about their own experiences and trying to kind of wrap their heads around it. And I feel like sometimes people don't even realize that they're maybe engaging in perfectionistic behaviors when they are. And I think sometimes that comes down to the various motivations that somebody might be experiencing. So sometimes it's about that approval from others, like when you're talking about that socially prescribed perfectionism, which kind of maybe ties into avoiding feelings of shame. How do you see those kinds of underlying motivations show up, both in ways that people are aware of and in some ways that they might not even realize?
Okay. Oh, I love that question so much. Okay. So a lot of times perfectionists don't know why they're perfectionists. So when you talk to them and you ask, like, this is the philosophy of it, right? When you get into the whys and the values and, hey, why is this important to you? A lot of times they have no idea, man. So they're like, I don't know. I just kind of need to be the best, right? So it's like the best in what, right? The best doctor, the best musician, whatever, right? Okay. Why these values? Why this as opposed to something else? Why the best as opposed as opposed to second best or third or whatever, fourth, right? And a lot of times you're like, I don't know. I haven't really thought of it. So what's interesting is that when you think about it, so this is why I'm not necessarily, again, against perfectionism, but why I'm so skeptical of it, because fundamentally perfectionism is a coping mechanism for deep-seated shame. So to be fair, right, not everything that's a coping mechanism is automatically bad. And there are certainly bad coping mechanisms that maybe on the net average are bad, but fundamentally they have some good to them, right? Which is why obviously people still engage in them. So with perfectionism, I think it's unfortunately, it's a net bad for the most part. Even the relative part is sort of, it's a little bit dicey, like it kind of can get bad again, like I said before with OCD. But the point is, yeah, so it's pretty much a coping mechanism for deep-seated shame. And so what happens is the person kind of tells them, so let me just kind of get into some of the clinical parts here. Okay, so when you think about perfectionism in the context of narcissism, so narcissistic people tend to think they are perfect, right? So sort of the way that they deal with their shame is they kind of tell themselves, well, I'm already the best, right? I'm superior, I'm supreme, whatever, right? So what Nancy McWilliams calls the obsessive compulsive person, which is not the same thing as having OCD. To be fair, these are distinct constructs, even though they overlap in several ways. The point is to say for her, the way she describes it, the belief underlying that version of perfectionism is I can get there, right? So the narcissistic person says, well, I'm already there. Whereas the obsessive compulsive says, like, I can work at it and I can get there. So this is a little bit more in line with the relative one. Whereas the absolute one, again, like I am like supreme or I am perfect. That's more in line with narcissistic personalities. They literally believe they're perfect in every room, right? They're the best looking. They're the smartest. They get everything super quickly. quickly, nobody can challenge them, whatever, right? So with the obsessive compulsive personality, again, the idea is that like sort of I can work against my shame. So whereas the narcissist hides the shame from themselves, where it's completely unconscious, right? Or usually completely unconscious. The person who's obsessive compulsive, they feel the shame, then they chronically deal with it. So it's something that sort of permeates everything. You can use the words, colloquially, easily triggered. It's something that frequently pops up. And what happens is they automatically run to perfect. So let's say, because obviously you work with students. So let's say if I fail a test, right, the idea is it's devastating and, oh my God, I now have to study 10 times harder. So when a kid fails a test, what happens is they're like, I'm going to come home tonight and I'm going to study for 3-4 hours, right? And they really overdo it. And so what happens is the way that they deal with their shame is by doubling down on their work ethic. So the way that a lot of perfectionists see it is they see that they have to, so their shame is, first of all, when you think of shame, right? So it's not always, and I would say even often, it's pretty distorted. So the way that often they see themselves is as underdogs. So the way that they see themselves is that their shame is, it's reality based. So what unfortunately ends up happening is that they think of it as control, right? So they think of it in terms of control. They think I can control my work ethic, right? I can control the amount that I put in. So therefore, if I'm inherently stupid, which is indicated by this failure, I now can double down on my work ethic and I can work harder and I can start, again, very obsessive compulsive, and I can study harder and I can overcome that innate limitation. So interestingly enough, what happens when you look at that shame is a lot of times it's not reality based. So instead of maybe, as a hypothetical alternative, maybe challenging that shame and asking, well, okay, could there have been another reasons you didn't do so well on that exam? Could it have been that maybe you were too tired, right? Could it have been that for whatever reason, the subject just wasn't something that clicked for you initially, but maybe would have later. So you have all these alternative explanations that they just don't consider seriously. What they instead do is they double down and they tell themselves, I am stupid. Therefore, if I work 10 times harder than the next person, I'm going to overcome that. And a topic we'll get into, I'm going to be able to mask that.
Hey, it's Emily, and I strongly believe that students need to learn from a young age that they're valued regardless of their neurotype. That's the main goal in everything we do, and why we created the Neurodiversity University Educator Hub. And it so happens that now's your chance to join me in this huge paradigm shift by becoming a member of the Educator Hub. What's in it for you? We have monthly Q&A webinars with experts. You can hop on a video call for a one-on-one consultation with me or my colleague, Amanda Morin. We also have 5-minute PD videos and activities, just what you need for a quick in-service or faculty meeting. Plus, you'll be part of a community with message boards and monthly live calls so we can all connect and grow together. The window is open now, so join us and become a part of this amazing community, the Educator Hub. Join us at neurodiversity.university or look for a link in the show notes. I know some of the research that I've read also talks about how perfectionism can be domain specific. They may not try to be a perfectionist in all areas, but the way that I understand this particular research is that people tend to exhibit more of that perfectionism in areas that are their area of strength. So, for example, if you're a very talented artist, you might have more of those perfectionism traits showing up related to your artwork because you're already maybe at a high standard, but you could see how maybe that fear of failure influences that. Or if you're a really talented athlete, and you're doing your drills, or if you're a student who's really bright and you get very good grades, like you see it in schools. When I talk about perfectionism too, sometimes when I go and do trainings for educators and we talk about kids who are identified as gifted, people will always think, oh, well, gifted kids, those are the ones who are perfectionistic. And I said, well, not really, but we see it in schools with kids who that's their domain where they do well. So sometimes in the academic setting, we might associate it with kids who are bright. But I mean, it can be domain specific. It can be an area of strength, but obviously it can be other places too. I guess it just manifests differently.
Okay, so initially what happens is a person focuses on their area of expertise, but because of, again, the deep-seated shame and the sort of generalizing, and again, this doesn't apply to everybody. And then so what happens is because of the sort of deep-seated shame, the idea is sometimes they can accept failure in other, let's say, adjacent fields, and sometimes they can't, right? So an example would be, let's say somebody is pretty proficient in, let's say, statistics, right? So let's say they're, whatever, whiz in stats. And let's say for whatever reason, they're not so great in other subjects like algebra or geometry. So one could argue, okay, like easily one could say, well, okay, I'm great at this, but I'm not so great at that. But here's also the thing, right? Mathematics is an umbrella term. So therefore one can start now questioning, oh, am I really good at statistics? If I'm good at this, then why am I not good at this? So you are right. There's sometimes a way for it to be kind of sequestered and compartmentalized, but then also, unfortunately, a lot of times it is generalized. So what happens is that even though, yes, there are cases where the person can accept failure in other, again, adjacent domains, in some cases they can't, because it sort of sets that ruminative spiral. It's like, well, am I really this good? Imposter syndrome, as you know, comes up often. What if I'm really an imposter? What if all of this is meaningless? So unfortunately, what happens is perfectionism does become generalized. This is something that I definitely want to get into, especially in terms of autism, because anytime there's any sense of uncertainty academically, and again, to be fair, I don't want to really generalize because it's not true for everybody. But a lot of times when there's any uncertainty academically, even if it's in adjacent or other areas, it a lot of times can cause a ruminative spiral where the thinking is, well, maybe I'm not this. So again, it's one of those things where it can easily kind of creep up and creep into other areas. Although to be fair, it often doesn't happen in completely distinct areas, meaning like if a person is focused on academics, you often don't see this in athletics, meaning a lot of times they usually can accept, well, maybe I'm not such a great athlete after all. But I have to tell you, I've also seen cases where it is that a person wants to be both a phenomenal athlete and they're like, I can't accept failure here, nor can I accept failure academically. So like we said before, I mean, a lot of this is a spectrum. So it's like everybody falls in somewhere. And like with anything else, conceptually speaking, all of these are super fuzzy. Like people fall into so many different categories.
Yeah, for sure.
But I like that you brought that up. Yeah, domain-specific perfectionism is interesting.
Yeah. When I think about perfectionism, we know that it doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Yep.
And that there are these external systems that really can feed into it. So I think about schools and workplaces. They might have very rigid expectations for performance and deadlines or how they measure success. Or sometimes I feel like there's this situation where people keep raising that bar for themselves. But for a lot of neurodivergent people, ADHDers, autistic people, twice exceptional, like all those different labels, whatever that might be, there's this other layer on top of that. So for example, executive functioning challenges that make them feel like they have to overcompensate. So they become a perfectionist to pull up these areas that are the areas of struggle, or a heightened sensitivity to rejection that drives them towards people pleasing. How do you see those kinds of environments and personal factors really kind of working together that pushes that perfectionism to the extreme?
Yeah, so before we start, let me just actually read a quote.
Okay.
This is a quote from Frances Tustin. So she was a psychoanalyst, and she was one of the sort of, I guess, the pioneers of autistic research back in her day. So this is going to be the foundation for what I'm going to answer. So she wrote, the autistic child and the autistic part in all of us hanker after certainty, after freedom from doubt, after complete knowledge, after unalloyed satisfaction. The hard fact that this is unattainable is a psychic rock upon which psychic development has foundered. Their emotional and cognitive development has been crippled by the umbrage aroused by it. So this is what I'll say. So when it comes to, the nature and nurture debate, which is obviously no longer a debate. So the idea is that environments either reinforce, which is probably pretty terrible, or they actually support the person, right? So they either reinforce the kind of more or less innate kind of tendencies, whether it's cognitive distortions, whether it's, the complete distress after failure or after rejection, or obviously they support the person, right? So, and, I'm sure you see this with a lot of your 2E kids where, parents are sometimes a little bit more supportive, sometimes less. So the idea here is that fundamentally speaking, people are sort of, they have these genetic dispositions toward these particular, let's say, tendencies toward being highly sensitive, toward needing a lot of support. We have this with the concept of the orchids and the dandelions, right? The orchid kids are essentially kids that need a lot more environmental support. But the point is to say the environment doesn't necessarily cause it, which is sometimes the thinking. And going back to psychoanalysis, the thinking as well, if you had a certain type of upbringing, of course, you're going to be like this. So as an example, right? So let's say if you grew up in a pretty harsh household, the idea is, well, of course, you're going to be a perfectionist. Your parents were highly demanding. Nothing was ever good enough. Let's say their mood swings were kind of unpredictable. It was hard for you to sort of figure out what worked and what didn't. And so obviously you had to be a perfectionist because the idea was if you weren't perfect, chaos ensued. So the problem with that interpretation is, yes, that's a part of it, but the other part of it is also the high sensitivity and the high vulnerability. So there's also this kid that also desperately needs to kind of alloy or kind of satisfy or mitigate chaos. And so the point is to say that this is sort of where the combination comes in. And of course, a lot of these parents do tend to have either personality issues or their own kind of mental health struggles. But the idea there is that when a person develops, let's say, I don't want to use masking because it's just a general term, but let's say they develop the coping mechanisms of they develop perfectionistic tendencies. what ends up happening is that, like, unfortunately, it's sort of innate tendencies coming to fruition, meaning the environment, again, makes it more or less likely that they're going to engage in them. To be fair, with people, as I'm sure you know, who are autistic, let's say when people have, let's say, difficulties managing emotions or whatever, so the idea that stuff is going to come up, right? But the environment can certainly exacerbate it. So rather than having a sort of calming, a soothing environment, one where, let's say, the person is able to kind of internalize a more nurturing parent, what happens is all of their doubts and their suspicions kind of come to pass. So if you have this kid who essentially thinks like, oh, the doubt, right? The self-doubt is, what if I'm not good enough? What if I'm not doing things well? What if I'm required to be perfect? And then you have a parent or some other environment that says, yeah, all of this stuff is true. You do need to be these things and you are terrible. So yeah, what essentially happens is you get this genetic vulnerability and then it's reinforced with the environment.
Sometimes people struggle with this idea that they don't necessarily want to get rid of those high standards.
Yeah.
There are some benefits to having, externally, I guess, the validation or the success that comes along with that, if you're not also paying attention to perhaps negative stuff that might come out of it on the other side. And so, like, on the one hand, if you're striving to do well and you're taking pride in your work, that's great. But then also the flip side is that it can be exhausting and lead to burnout. And so what does a sustainable alternative to perfectionism look like?
Yeah, so great question. So I would first ask, what is perfectionism founded on to begin with, right? And so, again, super complicated. So I'm going to just try to get into some of the important parts or more important parts. So I'm actually going to go back to something you said, domain-specific perfectionism, because I think that's super important to this.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens a lot of times is that when people want to be part of groups, and it's usually elite groups, perfectionism. So when they want to be part of elite groups, the idea is that everybody's great, right? So if I enter, let's say, let's say I want to be a part of Mensa or something. It's just to come to the top of my head, right? Let's say I'm like, I want to be a part of Mensa, right? So the thinking there is that everybody in Mensa is perfect, right? They have everything together, right? This is sort of now absolute perfectionism, or at least closer to that end of the spectrum. So now the thinking is, it's like, yes, they may not be great athletes, obviously, but the idea is, well, they're very well put together. They manage their emotions really well. They have great priorities. They're ambitious and they fulfill their goals whenever they want to. They're obviously highly intelligent, etc., right? So the idea there is that, like, well, everybody's like this, yet I'm the imposter, right? I'm the outcast. So here, the sense of perfectionism is based on fitting in, right? Again, it happens with a lot of autistic people. And so the idea is that in order to fit in, I have to be perfect. Yeah. So, you can kind of trace this back into childhood, not to get into this too much, because I don't think it's personally that important. But the idea is, at least usually it's not that important, to be fair. But the idea there is that when you trace it back to childhood, a lot of times the sense is that, well, this is sort of what my parents told me. My parents told me, you have to be perfect to fit into this household. And so this person then feels that way about a particular environment, which might be completely baseless. So going into your question of an alternative, one would have to really challenge why the perfectionism exists in the first place. So what is it doing for the person? Is it actually helping them? Will it get them what they want? A lot of times the answer is obviously no. And is it also necessary? So when a person comes into like a group like Mensa, is it true that they expect you to be perfect? Is it really maybe just about a bunch of like high IQ people who have probably shared interests getting together and like hanging out and becoming friends? Or is it that, like, no, they expect a perfect society, like a Justice League of sorts or whatever, So when we think about alternatives, this is, I think, the best answer that I could give to that. I want to give a person a specific alternative less than what I would actually want is for them to actually challenge or try to challenge the foundations of their perfectionism and actually come up with an alternative for themselves, meaning come up with their own value system, figure out a life and a way of living that can work for them, figure out a way of life and of living that can actually work in the broader community, to be fair. Because again, you do have to adapt. And again, this is the part of relative perfectionism I do kind of appreciate, because you do have to adapt to your environment. But the point is to say is that it's not super idiosyncratic, because I don't want to say like, well, everybody has their own unique purpose. I don't agree with that. But I would say that everybody has to come up with their own value system, or at the very least figure out which value system to internalize. So with that being said, I don't want to give an alternative, but I do want people to challenge the foundations of why they believe what they believe and essentially why they do what they do. And listen, if at the end of the day, man, if a person looks through all their options, has a clear sort of eye view of them, and says to themselves, you know what, I still want to be more veer toward the absolute perfectionism side of the spectrum. This is what I feel like works best for me. I mean, you're an adult. You can kind of do what you want. If that's the way you want to live, you want to live it. I completely understand. But to be fair, I think a lot of times when people do make that decision, it's still based on like some level of delusion and denial where they're like, no, I'm not going to accept what you're telling me. Like I still don't believe it. And some people will really need to experience it for themselves, which is like, hey, it's kind of like touching a hot stove. I get it. Some people want to. So with that being said, yeah, I would say that like whatever the alternative is, it's something that has to be a little bit more sort of philosophically inclined, meaning something that you would have to really need to think through, because honestly, man, I don't want to give you a root cause, but I would say one of the biggest, if there are root causes or sources of perfectionism, is honestly the lack of thought, man.
Yeah.
So more than anything, more than giving people options, I want them to actually think deeply and figure out why they're making, again, the choices and the same choices that they made, and particularly try their best to come up with options on their own, because what we want more than anything is for people to become deep thinkers as opposed to ruminative thinkers. So ruminative thinkers spiral about the same things over and over again, right? There's no actual process there. It's just like, I don't know, I guess a whirlwind of sorts, right? Whereas, and it's like a hurricane, you could kind of, as a metaphor, obviously. But like when you think about deep thought, right? Deep thought goes somewhere. Deep thought progresses. Deep thought sort of takes your character into consideration. Deep thought asks like, who do I want to become? What do I want to build? So that more than anything is what I want for somebody, rather than considering or creating some sort of particular, maybe cookie cutter alternative for them.
Yeah. I like that. And I like how you're kind of talking through what some of those guiding questions might be for somebody to reflect on. Do you ever come across people who don't realize that they're perfectionists, that they have these high standards, that they're pushing themselves beyond what's realistic in certain situations, but they don't even recognize that that's the pattern that they're in?
So is the question that like they wouldn't label it as perfectionism?
Yes.
Yeah. So that does happen, right? I mean, but they know that there's something different, to be fair. So they might not label it as that, but they might just say or think of it as just the way things are, right? Well, I have to hold myself to a higher standard. So I've had experiences from my clinical work where people haven't maybe necessarily known that that's a thing, where they're like, oh, wow, like that's perfectionism. Or they wouldn't have known that or seen that as unhealthy, right? So yes, you are right. So going back to that sort of lack of deep thought, the understanding as well, that's just the way things are. Why think about it too deeply? Yeah, so they wouldn't label it as perfectionism, but they do know that their way of living is still significantly different from whatever the other person is. Where they might say, well, I know like this person doesn't have those standards for themselves, but I still have to.
I love this topic so much, and I feel like this time has flown by. And I'm thinking we need to do another episode on this because I have so many more things that I want to ask. So we're going to have to get a part 2 on the calendar. Yeah. But as we wrap up today, I have one last question for you. If you were talking to a client who's dealing with perfectionism that is having a significant negative impact on their life, what would you tell them? Like, what is the first thing that you would really want them to hear?
Yeah, you're in charge of that, man. So like, even though a lot of bad things unfortunately do happen to us, a lot of it is also our own thinking. So the way we see the world, our expectations, our sort of hopes for our own lives, what we look at is how we view self-esteem. So the idea is that if you can restructure your values, which is obviously easier said than done, the idea there is that you can live a happier life, right? So at the very least, and I would say, I'm going to actually now go back to where we started. So going back to relative perfectionism. So if a person says, hey, no matter what, I still want to be a perfectionist, and I know I'm unhappy, what do I do, right? So in this case, I would say, look, at the very least, it is an option to be a relative perfectionist, right? Again, you could kind of veer towards the middle part of that spectrum. And so with that being said, I would tell a person like, look, man, if you really want to be a perfectionist and you want to try it out, at least try out the healthier version and see what it's like, right? But again, the idea is still fundamentally beyond that. I still want to get into the deeper aspects of it, and I still want to ask the person, why is perfection important? What do you think this is going to do for you? How has this affected your life? How is this going to affect your life, etc.? But again, if a person kind of wants to meet in the middle and says, hey, I kind of want to have my cake and eat it too, I'm like, okay, if you want to try out to be a relative perfectionist and it's really important for you to be the best at whatever, I mean, at the end of the day, again, man, we all have to live our lives and we all have to make our mistakes. And honestly, more important, we all have to hold ourselves accountable for our choices.
Leon Garber, host of the Seize the Moment podcast. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Absolutely. And I love the show.
What really stayed with me from this conversation is the way that perfectionism can act like another form of masking. For many neurodivergent people, masking means editing how we speak, how we move, even how we show emotion, all to blend in or avoid judgment. Perfectionism can do the same thing, only it hides behind a polished exterior, flawless work, constant achievement, and the image that we've got it all together. The trouble is, living that way is exhausting. It asks us to silence the parts of ourselves that are messy or human. At some point, the cost of presenting that curated version of ourselves outweighs the approval it earns. The real growth begins when we start noticing when perfectionism is protecting us and when it's holding us back, and then learning to set down the armor so we can show up as ourselves. I'm Emily Kircher Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Leon Garber. He has a podcast called Leon's Existential Cafe, and you can find links to his work in the show notes. Teachers, school administrators, parents of students, we've opened the doors for sign-up in the Educator Hub right now. A few times a year, we invite new members, and in the Hub, we offer continuing education courses, roundtables, chat space, professional development trainings, and materials that teachers can take back to their schools and share with others as well. Teachers, you might want to ask your administrators if they'll cover the cost of your membership. It's not expensive at all, and we would love for your whole staff to be there. We have several school districts who provide our Educator Hub to their staff. There's a link in the show notes for you to sign up. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.